From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Well, welcome, Dr. Cadava, to Take on the South. It's good to have you. Listeners, welcome back to our latest episode of Take on the South.
Where are the listeners? Right here?
All three.
All three. Okay,
yeah,
good.
He's going to edit it to
Amazing.
different. Yeah, so we have all the cameras. And this is the podcast, Take on the South, of the University of South Carolina's Institute for Southern Studies. So I'm one of the hosts, Emily Allen, and I'm excited to share with you one of my conversations today with Dr. Cadava about history and culture of the South. So a little bit more about our guest. Our guest for today is Dr. Geraldo Cadava. Dr. Cadava is professor of history and Latina and Latino studies at Northwestern University. He is also a contributing writer for The New Yorker and is the author of The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, as well as the book Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland. So currently, he's writing a history of Latinos over the past 500 years, tentatively titled A Thousand Bridges, which we'll come back to. But that's to be published in 2026 by Crown. And he also hosts his own podcast entitled Writing Latinos and is co-editor-in-chief of the online magazine Public Books. So thank you, Dr. Cadava.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah.
And to just generally be on the University of South Carolina's campus. I've never been here. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's not as humid as some other parts of the Southeast. But
I hear.
yes. Oh, yeah. So glad you've made it through our South Carolina time so far, and glad to have you here.
Yeah.
To kind of give our listeners some background, though, about yourself, can you tell us about who you are and how you kind of came to do the work that you do?
Sure. So I am a professor of history and Latina and Latino studies at Northwestern University in Illinois, and I'm also the director of our American Studies program, which is an undergraduate honors major, the only major in the College of Arts and Sciences that requires students to write an undergraduate honors thesis.
Cool.
Very fun, totally fun. I'm actually teaching starting next week because we're on the quarter system, the thesis seminar. So I'm really excited to learn about all of their projects. Those are my kind of like teaching and administrative duties. I write about Latinos in the United States, immigration history, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, which is only about 60 miles north of the border. The border city closest to Tucson is called Nogales, Sonora, and its sister city just across the border is Nogales, Arizona. Right. So I spent a lot of time as a kid kind of traveling to Nogales to have lunch with my family and, sit on a donkey painted like a zebra and take pictures. Sure. All the things people do. My grandparents and mom would go for, cheaper medication to go to doctor's appointments, things like that. So I grew up like around the border and as a kind of biracial, half white, half Latino, and so I also spent a lot of time not only thinking about the border, but just about multiracial identities as well. And I think that personal experience very much has shaped what I'm interested in. My first book was about the Arizona-Sonora border since World War II, and I wrote about all of the business and cultural connections between Arizona and the neighboring Mexican state of Sonora. And then in my second book, I wrote about Latino conservatives in the Hispanic Republican, and that's largely because my grandfather, after whom I'm named, was a diehard Republican ever since the Reagan years. He recently passed away a couple of years ago, but he remained a Republican and became, I would say, increasingly conservative from 1980 until the time that he passed away. So I think writing about Latino conservatives, I was trying to understand like the bigger world that he was a part of. And so in a lot of ways, I think I've come to think that I have ended up writing 2 books about my grandfather, and now this will be my 3rd book about my grandfather, because I think his personal experience and the way that he talked to me about history and politics played a large role in my thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that maybe will help students kind of consider, like, if they go into research, like how their personal experiences factor into that. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's something that people don't think enough about. Is what brings us to the work we do.
Yeah, I think oftentimes, it's not a direct relationship in the sense that when I was a senior in college, well, first of all, when I was a senior in college, I thought I wanted to go be a lawyer. And so I worked as a paralegal at a corporate law firm for 2 years before going back to get my PhD. But when I went to get my PhD, it's not like I was thinking like, oh, I grew up near the border and from a biracial family, so I want to go study these sorts of things. I think, it's only, I don't know when, maybe in your late 20s, 30s, where you start to think about, why do I do the things that I do anyway? Why am I interested in this? And so they're kind of like post facto explanations, but they feel very true to me now. And they become, I think, even more motivating, because I think they really do help you find meaning in the work that you're doing. And I think you come to realize that as a scholar, I'm sure you feel this way too, and have your own version of this story, that your unique perspective on a topic really is shaped by your own personal experience and background. And the reason why, even if I learn of someone else writing a book about the Arizona-Sonora border or Latino conservatives, I have faith that what I'm going to say about it is going to be unique because it's me writing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your thoughts on different things.
Yes.
Kind of your take on
Sure.
stuff. You already mentioned a second ago kind of what you did with your first couple books, and that you're also writing this larger history at the moment. So can you tell us a little bit more about your latest book that you're working on, A Thousand Bridges, and what are kind of the key things that you hope people take away from this book you're currently working on?
Totally. So right now it's called A Thousand Bridges, which is a quote from Jose Vasconcelos, the Mexican Secretary of Public Education after the Mexican Revolution. And he wrote a famous essay called The Cosmic Race. That was a kind of celebration of Mexican mestizaje, the kind of mixture of all of Mexico's cultural influences to make up Mexican national identity. That essay has probably come in for a lot of criticism over the past 50 years for the ways that it ignores blackness and, only kind of performatively includes indigenous groups. But there's a line in there about how Latin America kind of establishes a thousand bridges to lots of conversations about culture and history. And I think I started to think about how Latino history, rather than a kind of contained subject, is really just kind of the beginning point of 1,000 different conversations. And because a lot of ways, we've spent the last few years kind of even debating what Latino identity means, whether it's a thing, whether it's so diverse and diffuse as to be intangible, you can't really grasp it. And for me, the point about Latino history, culture, politics, it's never to precisely define what Latino means, but to understand conversations about Latinidad as the point of Latinidad itself. They're kind of beginning points of conversations. So that's what the title is referencing. I think the main thing I want to do, there have been a few big books written about Latino history. Ironically, not many of them by Latino historians. One's written by a journalist, one's written by a law professor and sociologist. One is written by a historian, but he is primarily an early modern Europeanist who writes largely about the 17th and 18th centuries and only later got into the history of Latinos. So I do think that we're kind of ready for a reappraisal of Latino history. And I think the main thing I want to do is that the main idea about Latino history has been that Latinos are a colonized people who've been oppressed by the forces of imperialism. They're victims of empire, and it's America's kind of imperial interventions in the United States that have led them to migrate to imperialism by the United States that have led them to migrate to the country in the first place. There's a famous quote about how, like, we're here because you were there. You know, the U.S. went there, became involved in domestic affairs, and then prompted migrants to come north. And I think that that is true. I mean, colonialism, colonization, those are really important experiences. But I think that to understand Latino history is to recognize that it's much more complicated in the story of being victims and oppressed. I think Latinos throughout our history have also been colonizers, oppressors, not only of indigenous communities throughout Latin America, but also of enslaved communities throughout the Americas and even of other Latinos today. So, you know, I think that's the kind of jumping off point. But I think where it came from for me was with the last book I wrote, The Hispanic Republican. I got really involved in the world of thinking about Latino partisan politics today. And, you know, we're inclined to think about it as the divide between Democrats and Republicans. Everyone wants to know, are Latinos like more Democrats or more Republicans? And for me as a historian, I want to answer that question a little differently by kind of sidelining partisan politics and talking about all of the like internal fissures within the Latino community over hundreds of years that have led to differences today.
Yeah. Were there any kind of like challenges you feel like you faced as you've been working on that book? Because it sounds like you're covering so much time and chronology.
Yeah.
Like kind of what methodologically and whatnot, like what has the journey been like for you in working on this book?
It's still very much a journey. I'm still kind of in the middle of the process. So my answer in a year from now might not be the answer that I give you now. And when you first asked the question, I thought maybe you were asking about like the political sensitivities of writing about Latinos as colonizers. And colonizers, I'm not even sure if that's the right word.
Right.
I think that it has the obvious appeal of like colonialism being an old and recognizable category in Latino history. But what I'm really talking about are all of the reasons that Latinos have felt differently about a whole range of subjects. Why they've served in the U.S. military because they're patriots and loyalists to the United States. Why they believe different things about healthcare and home ownership and things like that. So I'm not sure that colonizer and colonized is the ultimate framework I'll use, but it's kind of what I'm working with right now. I think that kind of conceptualization makes it hard, but also for sure, you know, writing about such a sweep of time, such a diverse and complicated series of communities, really, it involves a lot of choices. And then on top of that, trying to write this book for a trade audience and have a narrative that is accessible, compelling, draws readers in, makes them want to keep reading the book, that presents its own challenges. So where I've landed so far is, first of all, I think a lot of short chapters instead of a few longer chapters is what I'm going to do, because I want to think of each chapter as a kind of problem or a scene. Like maybe I'm talking about Simón Bolívar and his ideas about newly independent Latin American republics in one chapter. I mean, that in and of itself is a subject that many scholars have written books about, but I'm trying to find the kind of most representative examples. And I think one of the challenges is therefore to really be careful about the scenes that I select that involve characters, moments of drama that can also stand in for much bigger themes. And so that's kind of the challenge so far. Another one is that in a lot of ways, this book is a kind of synthetic reinterpretation, because after all, Latino historians have been writing Latino history for decades and decades, almost a century by this point, you know, in terms of like when academic historians began thinking about and writing about Latino history. So I'm also thinking about what the balance is going to be between synthesis and original primary source research. And in a lot of ways, I think with synthesis, what I hope to accomplish is using pieces of other scholars' work, but then grafting my own argument on top of it as a kind of reinterpretation of the field, but then also thinking about what are the topics that I need to do primary source research on. So for example, like monuments. I mean, there's a monument to Simón Bolívar, the father of Latin American independence in Miami, that Latinos on the right and the left kind of congregate around when it comes to Latin American Independence season, which happens to be now and kind of maps onto Hispanic Heritage Month. So, using monuments as a way into these debates about history and memory and identity, that might be the kind of thing that I can contribute to through primary research.
Yeah, I appreciate the level of care that you clearly have with crafting this. Like even like you bringing up at the beginning of your response there, like the tensions between whether like the terms colonizer and colonized work, and also like you're trying to articulate your work in this way that still makes sense to a mass audience, which is really important.
Totally.
So I think that's really impressive and important what you're doing there with kind of juggling this nuance. As we talked about, your background obviously is another, like your positionality that you bring to this topic too, I think helps a lot with this. So I'm really looking forward to the book to hear more about this. And I'm glad that you're thinking about these things because I think it will show.
Well, we'll see where it lands. I mean, it's that will be the ultimate test to see if it comes together and makes sense. But yeah, these are hard things to do, and it's a very different kind of project than what I've worked on so far, which, especially with my first book, a scholarly book, the book that I wrote as my dissertation turned into a book, the book that in really ways was written for an audience of my dissertation committee to approve the dissertation, then in a slightly expanded academic audience. And in this book, I think, there's also this challenge that I think academics trying to write for larger audiences face, which is making sure that the scholarship is sound, appropriately references all of the scholarship that has come before, but doesn't get bogged down in a scholarly apparatus, So, so it's a different sort of project that what I'm trying to think about is how to incorporate some of the lessons I've learned about trying to write for a broader audience back into my academic training, like even in terms of having graduate students write prospectuses that think about their projects along the same kind of lines that I've been thinking about with this project. It's a different process, but one that I ultimately think is rewarding and challenging.
Yeah, and I think there's a big push, I assume, in your field, and I know in my field we have a lot of discussions about doing things like public musicology and doing kind of more outward-facing work. So it sounds like that's kind of something in your field also that's a big like push.
Totally. I think, I think the pressures are coming from different places. I think part of it comes from this, frankly, like condescending idea that academics are just like eggheads with our heads in the clouds, that we're not thinking about or writing about, and certainly not communicating in ways that are relevant to broader forms of discourse. And I think a lot of academics are pushing back against this idea by, one, noting that, no, we've been here all along and we have been, involved in public conversations, but also trying to experiment with new kinds of discourse that might take us as academics a little bit out of our comfort zone, like talking on a podcast, like writing for magazines and newspapers, like writing different kinds of books that we've done. So I think, I don't know if it's to justify our existence as academics so much. I also think that this is at least true for me. I don't know if it's true for other academics, but I think we feel like, well, you know what? We've actually done a lot of actual research on this topic. Presumably, we've done that research because we think it's important, and so we need to be sharing it with the world because we've committed our careers to understanding this thing that we think is important, and so we want to convince others of its importance as well.
Yeah, that's a lot to navigate. And I know that during your visit here at USC, you're kind of doing that by speaking to some topics that I think a lot of people are thinking about right now. I know that one of the topics that you were talking about, as you were kind of alluding to at the beginning, in terms of like your book on like conservative Latino voters, right? So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts based on that history, you know, and kind of your research. What are some of your findings that you found historically on kind of Latino voting trends here in the U.S., I guess?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing, many people think of it as something that sounds like a surprise, but really shouldn't be, is that Latinos have been Republicans for a long time, and they've even, you know, as the meaning of what it means to be a Republican has changed, Latinos have kind of followed along and kind of become loyalists to the party. As a historian, one of the things that I find interesting is that the percentage of Latinos that have supported Republicans has remained pretty consistent across a 50 or 60 year time period, where it's like between a quarter and a third, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, of Latinos since the 1970s have voted for Republicans. So that teaches us a lot of things. It teaches us that we shouldn't be surprised today when we learn that a third or more of Latinos vote for Republicans, because that's within a historical norm. I also think it's fascinating that that number, that percentage has been so consistent, even though the Latino community in the United States has changed a lot in that 50 or 60 year period. I mean, we were once maybe 3 or 4 or 5% of the population. Now we're 20% of the population. So even as it's grown, that has stayed pretty consistent. And despite the fact that the Republican Party has really changed over the past 50 years, it's no longer like Ronald Reagan's party or George W. Bush's party. It's Donald Trump's party. And the fact that it's changed very little and has kind of remained pretty consistent despite all of those changes, I think is also interesting to think about. And so for me, the lessons of history when thinking about the Latino vote, you know, it always helps remind me that what we think of today as like big news, you know, groundbreaking news that deserves a lot of press and time and research and attention is actually part of a longer trend. I think what has happened in the past few years in particular is that it became particularly surprising that Latinos would vote for a Republican like Donald Trump, given the fact that we thought his campaign kind of got kicked off and remains today in many ways defined by restrictive immigration positions, like really kind of, you know, some of the harshest rhetoric about immigrants that we've seen in a long time. And Latinos seem to have not been as turned off by that as we thought they would be. And the question is why? I mean, is it that Latinos are actually becoming more conservative? Is it that immigration was never the mobilizer that we thought it was? What is it? Is it about the appeal to first or second generation Latinos who recently naturalized and left, left-wing regimes in Latin America and therefore come to the United States looking for law and order and security that they believe will help them pursue their American dream? Or is it like third and fourth generation Latinos who are more assimilated, speak English, maybe are intermarried, and have moved from cities to suburbs that don't have a lot of other Latinos? So I think these are all big questions kind of sparked by the fact that Donald Trump has drawn more Latinos into the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think that'll really resonate with people right now with current election season and whatnot. And you brought up another topic, too, that I wanted to ask you about, kind of looking back a little bit, which is how immigration policy in the U.S. has kind of developed over the last century or so. So you were kind of alluding to it a second ago, but can you speak to us a little bit what we can also, I think, learn from those policies, I guess?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to note that would be of relevance today is that we are still, I think some of the inflection points have changed, some of the tone has changed, but I think we're really living in an immigration moment defined by, the rise of undocumented immigration, the signing of the Immigration and Nationality Act in the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, that's the time when the makeup of the United States and the Latino population in particular really changed. And the naturally born Latino population has increased a lot since the 60s. The number of countries that Latinos have come from has expanded a lot over the past few decades. So just the Latino population has become much more diverse. It's still 2/3 Mexican American, which is important to remember that even if as we get kind of carried away by thinking about Cuban exile politics or recent Venezuelan arrivals, Puerto Ricans who've left the island to come to the United States, I think it's still important to remember that 2/3 of Latinos are still Mexican Americans. But, a lot of the increase in the size of the population and the diversification of the population has happened over the past 50 or 60 years. And I think that as that has happened, we as a country, our politicians in DC have struggled to figure out how to best approach it. And so as soon as the undocumented population started to rise in the late 1960s, early 1970s, not only because of the immigration law, but also because of the establishment of cross-border factories called maquiladoras in Mexico that brought Mexican immigrants to the border and then just a step further into the United States. As the undocumented population has increased, politicians have really struggled to figure out what to do about them. And so since the 70s, they've proposed a combination of pathway to citizenship, which is like the regularization of someone's status, hiring more Border Patrol agents to quote unquote secure the border, employment sanctions that fine employers for hiring undocumented immigrants unknowingly, and deportations and visas, those sorts of things. All of those tools that legislators debated in the 1970s are still the tools that politicians are debating right now. How many people to let in, how many people to deport, whether we should create pathways to citizenship or whether we need to just shut the border down. The conversation has remained remarkably the same for the past 40 or 50 years. And there have been some important moments along the way, like the Immigration Reform and Control Act, Reagan's kind of large amnesty bill that also hired more border patrols, also had measures to secure the border. Then there was Bill Clinton's Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which stripped kind of social benefits from asylum seekers and people here in the United States on asylum. And then there was 9/11. Bill Clinton's was in 1996. Then there was 9/11, which has really created a kind of anti-immigrant mood within the United States. It's where you see kind of all Republican politicians kind of racing to talk the toughest about the border, from John McCain's Build the Danged Fence to Herman Cain proposing an electrified border wall to Donald Trump chanting Build the Wall. So, we're still in a moment that has been shaped, I think, over the past 40 or 50 years. And it's a starkly different moment than what came earlier because, in the early 20th century into the mid 20th century, like Mexican immigration wasn't regulated all that much. I mean, the big immigration legislation in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, kind of did nothing about Mexicans or any Western Hemisphere migrants. So it really is astounding to think about, the relationship between the past and present and how different things feel today compared with 100 years ago. And also, at the same time, how we're still kind of stuck in this dynamic that we've been in for the past 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insight on kind of like the voting trends and like immigration policy. I think you have given our listeners a lot to think about.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Probably even just scratch the surface. But
yeah, and I think that's where I think hopefully people will like look into your work and use it as a resource to kind of navigate these questions that we're dealing with. But I kind of wanted to open up the floor to you, like with your expertise and with everything we've been talking about. Is there anything else you feel like our listeners need to know about these topics?
Sure. I think there's, of course, I, as someone who am Latino and has studied and written about Latinos for the past 25 years, think that there are endlessly fascinating stories and an innumerable range of subjects to discuss. So of course I would think that, but I really do think that we're at a moment right now where we're kind of defining and redefining what the Latino community is going to look like and how we're going to talk about it over the next 50 years. I think our thinking about it has kind of opened up a lot in the past few years, where in political terms, for sure, we're no longer thought of only as Democrats. I think ideological diversity is something that most people thinking about Latinos today are ready to accept. I think that this idea that Latinos are not a monolith is probably another idea that many Americans are willing to accept. But I would say that what that means is still needs to be understood better. It's no longer just about like national diversity. Like we have Mexicans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans. I mean, we have evangelicals and Catholics and non-religious Latinos. We have urban Latinos and rural Latinos. We have citizens and non-citizens. We have Democrats and Republicans. And so I think in a real way, like our understanding of Latinos has exploded in a very good way over the past few years, because now that all these pieces are up in the air, we have to figure out how it's going to be put back together. And I would just say that for your listeners, as a kind of starting point for thinking about Latinos, is just accept from square one that Latinos are diverse in all of the ways I just mentioned, and probably a million other ways that I haven't mentioned. And so take that as your starting point and understand that, where you live too, your local economy is also probably being transformed by Latinos in ways that might not be immediately recognizable. But by this point, Latinos are no longer just regional populations. We're kind of spread all across the United States, even right here in South Carolina. And the South, in fact, is, you probably know, is like one of the fastest growing regions for Latino communities. So, there's a lot that historians have written about and know about, but a lot left to explore. And so I would encourage listeners to kind of go into thinking about Latinos with a sense of openness and curiosity.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. And it was good to have you on Take on the South.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And, good luck to you and everyone here at the center you work at. This is called the Institute for Southern Studies. Is that right?
Yes.
So good luck to you and everyone else at the Institute for Southern Studies and all of the great work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's great to have you here on campus, and I know our students will look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us too. Have a good one.
Yes.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.